Hey guys, it's Lily. Today I'm going to be talking about ADD versus ADHD, what diagnosing it looks like at different ages, and my personal experience with all of it. So hi, hi. Okay, there's the other one. So I find the history of ADHD really interesting, actually. So I want to share that really quick. But the first accepted documentation of ADHD is from 1798 by Sir Alexander Crichton. It was descriptions of ADHD like behaviors in children and adults, but he noted it as mental restlessness, distractibility, and difficulty sustaining attention. In 1902, Sir George Frederick Still described children who, despite normal intelligence, showed impulsivity, poor self control, and difficulty maintaining attention or moral regulation. In the early to mid 1900s, as medical thinking evolved, the condition was labeled in many ways, including minimal brain damage, later minimal brain dysfunction, and then it developed into terms emphasizing the hyperactivity. So, how did the naming of it evolved during this time. In 1968, the DSM-2 was the first official diagnosis, but it was called the hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. So it was thought that you would grow out of it, and it was mostly focused on hyperactivity and impulsivity. In 1980, though, the third edition of the DSM renamed it to Attention Deficit Disorder, ADD, with or without hyperactivity. And it brought in the idea that attention and distractibility were in the core definition. But then there were subtypes, ADD without the hyperactivity and ADHD with hyperactivity. In 1987, the third edition of the DSM merged ADD and ADHD into a single diagnosis, ADHD. So now in our DSM-5, the diagnosis has been refined into what your prominent symptom is. There can be a predominantly inattentive or a predominantly hyperactive and impulsive, or a combined presentation. As for diagnosing, before 1968, there was no formal diagnosis. Doctors just described the behavior or moral control problems using terms like minimal brain dysfunction or hyperkinetic behavior. By 1968, the hyperkinetic reaction of childhood focused on the hyperactivity and impulse control, often overlooking the mental inattentiveness or memory problems. 1980 and later, ADD was formally recognized in attention and distractibility as being those core symptoms. After 1987, ADHD with the different definitions became more of a spectrum from hyperactivity versus inattentive versus those things blending. So, some real evaluation methods for ADHD, ADD that I have personally experienced was when I was working in an elementary school. I had a student who was actively undergoing diagnosis, and I didn't know necessarily that she was being evaluated until I was given a sheet from admin and was like, "We need you to fill this out for this student." And it was basically like a questionnaire, and it was like scale from 1 to 5, their reaction to authority, scale from 1 to 5, their distractibility in new places or in regular areas, different things like that. Kind of just gauging her personality. Um, I found out that this was also given to her primary teacher, admin, her parent, and a outside babysitter that took care of her often. So this measured all of those different things with different authoritative figures in different places at different times of the day. The doctor then compared all those different surveys to see if she had these symptoms anywhere, anytime, or if it could be linked to a specific person or a specific place. Hey guys, it's Lily. Today I'm going to be talking about ADD versus ADHD, what diagnosing it looks like at different ages, and my personal experience with all of it. So hi, hi. Okay, there's the other one. Mm-hmm. All right, lay down. No, Diana, enough. Stop. Down. Here, you guys need a treat. So ADD, ADHD, let's talk about it. I'm gonna wait for them to be done chewing. So no. Okay, so first I found the history of ADHD very interesting. So I want to talk about that a little bit. In 1798, Sir Alexander Crichton had the first what is recognized as the first published detailed. So in So I find the history of ADHD really interesting, actually. So I want to share that really quick. But the first accepted documentation of ADHD is from 1798 by Sir Alexander Crichton. It was descriptions of ADHD-like behaviors in children and adults, but he noted it as mental restlessness, distractibility, and difficulty sustaining attention. In 1902, Sir George Frederick Still described children who, despite normal intelligence, showed impulsivity, poor self control, and difficulty maintaining attention or moral regulation. In the early to mid 1900s, as medical thinking evolved, the condition was labeled in many ways, including minimal brain damage, later minimal brain dysfunction, and then it developed into terms emphasizing the hyperactivity. So, how did the naming of it evolved during this time. In 1968, the DSM-2 was the first official diagnosis, but it was called the hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. So it was thought that you would grow out of it, and it was mostly focused on hyperactivity and impulsivity. In 1980, though, the third edition of the DSM renamed it to Attention Deficit Disorder, ADD, with or without hyperactivity. And it brought in the idea that attention and distractibility were in the core definition. But then there were subtypes, ADD without the hyperactivity and ADHD with hyperactivity. In 1987, the third edition of the DSM merged ADD and ADHD into a single diagnosis, ADHD. From then on, DSM 5, the diagnosis to was refined into presentations based on your dominant symptoms. So there was a predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive. So now in our DSM 5, the diagnosis has been refined into what your prominent stimulants are. The most effective and most commonly prescribed ADHD medications. They increase the dopamine and norepinephrine, which support your focus, motivation, and impulse control. Examples of those stimulants include methylphenidate-based like Ritalin, Concerta, and Focalin, or amphetamine-based like Adderall, Vyvanse, and Dextrin. I took Concerta, um, and I didn't really have any side effects with it. I took the slow-release tabs, um, slow-release versus quick-release stimulants. Um, Short release, immediate release tabs typically last 3 to 4 hours in your system, and they kick in quickly. But people who have the short release, if they want to have that feeling all day, they do have to take it 2 to 3 times a day to maintain it in their system. And there is a more noticeable on off feeling. So once you take it, you're on versus the seconds out of your system, you can recognize it. So this is helpful for fine tuning a dose for specific timing. For example, children in schools will take it first thing in the morning and then again at lunch. Or if you're a college student, you have a short term just to study for exams and then you're good again, or just to take some type of test and then you're good again. versus long release tablets are usually last 8 to 12 hours. So you take it once a day and there's a smoother transition in that on off. It's not a, okay, I'm ready to go. I need to take my pill. I'm good now. It's a ease into it, ease out of it. So these are often preferred for most people who do want a consistent stimulant in their system. Many people combine both of these, a long release and a short release. So they have a long release in the morning, but then they take a short release booster in afternoons where they still have to be doing things. Um, like I said, I had the slow release. I had the slow release because I wanted the smoother transition from the in to off, because the stimulants obviously can increase your heart rate. And at that time, now I have anxiety, and increased heart rate can trigger anxiety. And I also had concerns for heart problems, but I'm fine. Anyway, I had a short release, but I knew students who had the quick release, and you could tell immediately whether they took it or not first thing in the morning, but our nurse was not allowed to give them another one until lunchtime. And you could tell the second they took it coming back from lunch, they were a different person. So I think it's kind of just to each their own, obviously, just like with what type of medication, what dose you use when, to each their own. Common side effects of stimulants do include reduced appetite, trouble falling asleep, irritability, stomach ache or nausea, increased heart rate, dry mouth, headache, feeling overstimulated or wired, and emotional sensitivity. Non stimulants are used only when stimulants don't work. So most people take the stimulants for, excuse me, non-stimulants are used only when stimulants don't work. So if you've gone through all of them and you either have terrible side effects or just can't do it for whatever reason, examples of non-stimulants are Strattera, Gunfacine, Clonidine, and bupropion. And they are typically slower to take effect, like they take days to weeks to be in your system. Side effects of those do include fatigue or sleepiness, nausea, low appetite, dizziness, mood changes, dry mouth, or mild blood pressure drops. Um, Talking about the side effects of medications, I had a different student who was medicated for ADHD, and they were changing her medication because she was having sleeping problems. So, on this new medication, obviously a 6-year-old cannot tell you, oh, I felt this at this time of the day, or I was able to write down at this time of the day I was super hungry, or I can't sleep very well. People have to observe a 6-year-old and figure out what the side effects could be. So we were monitoring her closely, trying this new medication, because her mom mentioned, she was like, I don't know if she just wasn't hungry last night or if it's the medication. And so we had to communicate with the mom regularly what she ate, how much she ate, if we noticed her getting overstimulated more or less, if she had any emotional outbursts that couldn't be regulated, or if she was having difficulty kind of recognizing her own hungry or sensory overwhelming, or if she was having her own difficulty recognizing her own triggers or hunger cues, different things like that. Because there are it is harder to medicate children in terms of dosaging, keeping it regular, them communicating their symptoms. Typically, ADHD diagnoses begin with behavioral therapies. So, cognitive behavioral therapy works well for adults as well, of course. It helps with procrastination, negative thoughts, and distractibility. Behavioral parent training is always recommended for a parent of a child diagnosed with ADHD. It teaches the parents how to structure an environment and reinforce desired behaviors. And executive function and organizational coaching help build skills for time management, planning routines, and breaking down tasks. This is also helpful for adults. Lifestyle and daily structure is super important for people with ADHD. Sleep hygiene obviously boosts your focus, mood, and impulse regulation. Regular exercise naturally increases dopamine and norepinephrine, so it increases those hormones that are giving to you in the stimulants. And diet support, obviously, like protein rich meals, stabilizing your blood sugar, and omega-3 supplements also help your general health and brain fog. When all of that is done, if you are still having problems, there are accommodations for students and employees as adults. Schools frequently can give diagnosed ADHD students extra time on tests, quiet testing environments, preferential seating, chunked instructions, and scheduled task breaks. In the workplace, you can get written instructions, time blocking, noise canceling tools, flexible schedules, and task management systems. I never personally had any accommodations or have known an adult who has accommodations in the workplace, so I can't speak personally on that. But for children, in elementary school at least, I know it was very normal to have fidgets, obviously. That's also just the time it is 2020, 2025. Everybody has fidgets. It was very normal, very accepted to have ADHD fidgets, even if you weren't diagnosed ADHD. If someone thought it helped you, it was very normal for a teacher to give it to a student as some sort of learning tool if it's used properly. So, fidgets to help with hyperactivity. And it's also not abnormal for ADHD diagnosed students that I worked with personally to have break cards. So, at least in the school I worked at, they were very heavy SEL teachers, social emotional learning. So, it wasn't abnormal for students to have access to cards that say, like, I need a break, or if they were had a specific situation with another teacher to say, I want to go visit this teacher for this amount of time, I want to see the nurse for this amount of time, just as like a brain break. Especially those ADHD diagnosed students, they could use those to help with a reward system, to an immediate reward system to get something done. That might be everything. As an adult, Siri helps me a lot with my ADHD. I'm constantly like, I'm not going to say it, otherwise my phone's going to activate. Hey, can you add this to my notes app? Can you add this to my shopping list? Can you set this alarm? Can you turn on this alarm? Can you set a reminder for this? So that's definitely a sorry AI, very helpful tool for me. Um, what else do I do? I didn't think I had too much of the hyperactivity until I was with somebody who is not hyperactive, and I definitely am up and going a little bit more than he is, but, I'm not I might be a little fidgety. I am fidgety, but I am more of a mental person, but that's also because of my anxiety. My anxiety and ADHD feed into each other, which is why I was medicated for a while I learned my coping skills. Um, what does that look like? Anxiety and ADHD feeding into each other. When I was younger and I couldn't regulate it very well before I was medicated, I frequently got into it was called a feedback loop from hell in one book. Basically, your anxiety, ADHD, whatever, maybe says one thing. For example, says, oh, I messed up this task. Your feedback loop from hell sends that to hell. I messed up this task. It comes back as I can't do anything right. You send that, it comes back as I can't help anybody. And it obviously just gets worse as it goes. Inattentive ADHD, my brain is constantly going, it's constantly feeding into that, versus anxiety, obviously assumes the worst, is going to keep channeling into that. Um, I just had to learn coping skills to pull myself out of that. Therapy, cognitive therapy is definitely very helpful for adults, especially in anxiety, ADHD, that need that help to have a better functioning life. I also recommend therapy for anybody, but I'm just that person. It's also 2025, so I'm just that person. Um, I don't know. I have found therapy works best for me when I go with a specific problem. Um, if I go in and say I need to talk about this today, I talk about it. I will cancel a therapy appointment if I feel like I'm good and I don't want to talk about anything. I won't talk about anything. After I've already done an appointment in silence, because then you're just avoiding the problem. So if I am like, okay, I had this trauma. I need to work through this trauma. We worked through that trauma. I stopped seeing that therapist because I was good. I didn't have anything else at that point. And then my anxiety started to become a lot, so I scheduled an appointment with my therapist, and we started to talk about the anxiety and the coping skills, medications. I continued seeing her while I was on medication because that's important to make sure everything is working properly and you're not just manic. Um, and then I stopped seeing her for a while. And then I decided I wanted to stop my medication. I scheduled an appointment before I stopped my medication to make sure it was a good choice, and then after I stopped my medication to make sure I wasn't just manic. Um, some people need to just see therapists all the time. Some people, it's good to just talk to them, talk about whatever, work through things. I have a friend who sees someone every other week just to kind of like talk about everything. And some people it just feels good to talk about themselves, especially if you're not a person that typically rants about yourself. Forcing yourself to focus on yourself for an hour is good. You need that. That might be the end of my therapy rant. That might be the end of my ADHD conversation. I don't know. What do you guys think? Any other questions? Drop them below. I would be happy to answer the ones that I can. Um, that might be all I got. Check me out on TikTok and Instagram. TikTok is more TikTok style content, just stupid schwat. Instagram, I try to be a little more aesthetically pleasing, not usually. Um, I set up my Spotify, which is the same videos as this, releasing at the same day, same time, just whatever your preferred listening platform is. Obviously on YouTube, same videos as on Spotify. Check out those links. I love reading your guys' comments. Before I say bye, I want to say that I think they're so fun. I love interacting with you guys. You guys are hilarious. Um, Also seeing how some of you argue with each other. I don't know. Sometimes that just does that make me a problem? Am I the problem if I just watch you guys argue about something? But I don't know the answer, so it's not like I can be like, if I know the answer, I have chimed in. But if I don't know the answer, I just stay out of it. Um, so keep commenting. It's really interesting. Till next time. Bye.